Now he's on this.
Welcome everyone, we're gonna get started. I wanna thank you all for coming and thank those of us who are joining us remotely or watching the recording. I know that a couple people have classes at 5:30 and stuff like that, so if you need to slip out, we will not have our feelings hurt, we understand. I'm gonna introduce myself and this series, because it's a new series, and then I will introduce our featured speaker. So I'm Professor Alex Roberts. I have many of you in class right now, so I know you know me, but for the benefit of folks online, I teach and write about trademark, IP, entertainment law, false advertising, and this is my third year at NUSL. And last year I chaired the CLIC task force, but this year is my first year as faculty director of CLIC, the Center for Law, Information, and Creativity. And also I want to shout out Dean Jennifer Hewer for all of her help and support throughout the year, and particularly today, and also introduce Wala, who has been super helpful, in particular with this event. So as director of CLIC, I have the privilege of thinking about the broader mission of the center and planning not just one-off events, but creating some new traditions. So like a speaker series, an annual event, things like that. And NUSL is a school that is renowned for its strength in training public interest lawyers and a community of students and scholars who are deeply passionate about social justice. And I see that passion in the classroom every day, and I'm not even teaching courses like criminal law or constitutional law, right? I'm teaching IP classes, but it has been really exciting to assign material at the intersection of those interests that gets students thinking about what it means to be an IP lawyer or an entertainment lawyer who focuses on social justice and cares tremendously about social justice. So what I wanted to do was launch an annual series at the intersection of social justice and all of the things CLIC focuses on, which are not just intellectual property, but also technology law and privacy law. And for the inaugural event, I didn't have to think that hard at all, because I saw Professor Moffat present a version of this paper a while back at a kind of small roundtable, and it really stayed with me. And that's saying a lot, because I see a lot of IP papers and works in progress, and some of them are more memorable than others, right? Some of them are not that memorable, but this one absolutely was, and I have thought about it many times since we met and discussed it. So, NUSL students have advocated for prison abolition, prison reform, and more fundamentally, working to ensure that incarcerated people are afforded basic rights and treated with dignity and respect. As Professor Moffat writes, this work is animated by the notion that people who are incarcerated are a part of society rather than apart from society. When we think about those basic rights, we often think about safe and nutritious food, bodily autonomy, access to knowledge and information, but we don't always think about art. And not just access to art, but freedom to create art and to engage in various forms of expression. And what follows from that expression, at least for folks who are not incarcerated, is copyright protection for original works of art and control over them, right? The ability to say who can copy, who can reproduce them, and to get paid for use by others. Not to mention access to the information and the resources that are needed to assert those rights. And as Professor Moffat discovered in her research, those are rights and freedoms that incarcerated people are often deprived of. The prison system attempts to deter and suppress artistic work and sometimes even punish its creators. She writes, in the prison context, copyright should be thought of as akin to a civil right and a part of the movement to reform the US carceral system, empowering those who create. Copyright behind bars should not operate any differently than copyright in the world. So with that, I'm gonna introduce our speaker. Professor Viva Moffat is a professor of law at Denver University Sturm College of Law and co-director of its intellectual property and technology law program. She holds an AB from Stanford, an MA from UVA, and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. She clerked for Judge Robert Beezer of the Ninth Circuit and worked as an associate at Keeker and Van Nest in San Francisco. And she teaches contracts and intellectual property and has written extensively about copyright, trademark, and patent, and also non-competes and non-competes in the context of those IP areas. So with that, I will turn it over, and we're going to leave plenty of time for questions later. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, especially to Professor Roberts for the invitation to CLIC. That's what we say, CLIC, for sponsoring this talk and flying me out here from Denver. Thank you to Dean Hewer and to Lola for helping coordinate and organize everything. And thank you to you all for being here in person. And I think there's some people on Zoom, maybe even some of my students are on Zoom. So I'm really just really pleased to be here and to talk with you about this project. Professor Roberts really gave a great summary and introduction. You know, maybe we can just talk now. But no, I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about this project that it started out as a paper and has become sort of part of a larger project of things I'm engaged with on an ongoing basis. And so I want to talk to you about sort of the genesis of the project, the paper, and some of the things that I have learned and done since the paper came out. And I think it's really, I hope, a perfect fit for this social justice and intellectual property series. And I think there's I find in my students and in the legal community a real hunger in the IP world for being able to work to advance social justice. And I've found many folks who are involved with the carceral reform, prison abolition system have been really interested in this project as well. So it's been an incredibly gratifying and interesting project to work on. So I'm really happy to share it with you here today. And I would say that overall, if I'm thinking about this as a larger project, I have kind of two goals with it, or two things that I want to do at least, which is to bring together these kind of, in some ways, two disparate worlds that they don't know anything about each other. IP lawyers, law professors, practitioners, and the carceral reform, prison abolition, criminal justice area. Those two worlds do not tend to overlap very often. So that's one thing that I thought about in working in this area. And then the other thing is, in a little bit more concretely, I suppose, is to think about how to provide information, resources, and support for incarcerated artists and their allies. And I have found there's a great demand and desire for learning about this topic and this area. So that's sort of become the larger vision of what I've done. I'll tell you a little bit about the genesis of the project, and in fact, how it really started, which started the way almost all of my projects start, which is that something makes me mad. So I read something or see something. When I was in practice law, there were things that bothered me that have turned into whole areas of research. Non-competes, for example, really bugged me, and so I've written a bunch about them. And so this also started from a thing I read that I just really irritated me. Let's see if I can figure this out. Nope. Nope.
You just need to click on
Oh, no.
slide to get what's on to the click right in.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Sorry about that. So as I said, as with many of my projects, something made me mad. And now this next thing I'm gonna show you is not the thing that made me mad, but it was sort of the beginning of it, which is that I saw this story in the New York Times written by a Guantanamo detainee, essay, I suppose, named Mansour Adefi, I think I pronounced that right, called "In Our Prison on the Sea." And he wrote, I'll let you read it for a moment, but he wrote really movingly about his experience being detained in Guantanamo. And he wrote in particular about the time when detainees finally got to see the sea. Some of them had never seen the ocean in their lives. And since they had been in Guantanamo, there had been big tarps up, preventing them from seeing the water, even though they were there on this, Caribbean island. So they had never seen the water. And he wrote about how they felt and what they did when they saw the water. And so this is a little bit of it, and I've put a link in here. But he says the detainees started making art about the sea. And for some reason I found this just so moving, this notion that anyone who could draw drew the sea, and people wrote poems about it. And so I found this to be incredibly moving, and sort of as an aside, it's just absolutely heartbreaking to me that we are sending people back to Guantanamo again. And so I was hoping that this was not going to be necessary to think about these things, but here we are. And so as part of this project, well, it's not my project. In Guantanamo, there was turns out huge amounts of art making. So as oops, there we go. Here's just one image of another Guantanamo detainee, Mohammed Ansi. And it turned out that after a while at the detention facility, as horrific as the conditions were, they did ultimately allow detainees to make art. They had art programs. Many of them made many beautiful, amazing things. And in many instances, their lawyers were allowed to take their artwork off the island. And ultimately, there was an exhibit at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Some of you may have heard about this. Some of you may have even had the opportunity to see it. I unfortunately didn't. But it was, by all accounts, this really stunning exhibit. And in fact, if you go online, you can still see the program for the exhibit. It has the words of many of the detainees, many of the images of their work. It traveled around the country in multiple locations. And there were paintings, drawings, poems, essays, sculptures, and it got lots of press, lots of critical acclaim, a lot of attention, including, and this is the thing that made me mad, from the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense, they were not happy with this. And this is, as I said, the thing that made me mad. Their response, they said, this is what I read in the New York Times that made me mad. The artwork remains the property of the United States government. And that's just wrong. At least from a copyright perspective, it never was the property of the United States government, and certainly could not remain the property of the United States government. So that made me really mad. Then there were also reports that they might incinerate the artwork. And that I thought was just cruel. Again, that made me mad. And then they canceled all the art programs at Guantanamo in response to this exhibit. And all of this is the thing that got me thinking about this project, sort of sent me down this road of thinking about it. And Guantanamo is obviously an unusual example. I guess I can't even call it part of the American prison system, although it's obviously sort of atmospherically part of the American criminal justice system. And so it is unusual. The people who are there are unusual compared to the rest of the American system, but in a lot of ways, this example is a microcosm of what I found in the rest of my work, which is that there's huge amounts of creativity in American prisons, that it is sometimes encouraged and tolerated, but then also sometimes punished and suppressed and deterred. So it shows sort of both sides of the coin and sort of the direction in which I'm going here, which is ultimately to say that this project is kind of both wildly aspirational, that is to hope that the American criminal justice system, the American prison system will allow and permit and even encourage this kind of work, is maybe overly optimistic. On the other hand, what I found in all of my research was that in fact there's huge amounts of artistic creation going on. It is happening. There are people in fact who are taking advantage of their copyright rights, but most people don't know about them. And so this project is about bringing these things together. So the Department of Defense didn't have to respond the way that it did to this exhibit. It didn't affect anything that was happening on the island. There was no reason for it. It was cruel. It was unnecessary. And after thinking about that, as I said, I went and I started looking at, well, what was going on about there? And I maybe shouldn't have been surprised, but I was really surprised at just the vast extent of creativity behind bars. And then what I kept thinking about was, well, this is what's going on behind bars is actually quite similar to what's going on, as they say, in the free world. So huge amounts of creativity behind bars, and that became kind of a theme of this project, as Professor Roberts said. We're all part of the same community, just some behind bars. And there are tons of programs and tons of people working in prisons on various kinds of work. I have just a few examples here that I found. One that I discussed in my article is a book of stories by Curtis Dawkins. Some of them are about incarceration, not entirely. And he actually, this was published by, I can't remember the publisher, he got $150,000 advance for this book. So he obviously did take advantage of the copyright system, exercised his rights as a copyright holder, as a creator. Much of the work, of course, does not get $150,000 advances, either behind bars or not behind bars. But there's such other incredible things. I picked this just because I love elephants. Beautiful drawing. There are posters. This is a poster from San Quentin, created by an incarcerated person, a kind of Southwestern theme thing going on, and all kinds of other things are more difficult for me to display here. There are theater programs. This photograph is from a theater program in a Colorado prison. There's music being made, sculptures, NFTs. I don't know if those are still a thing. They were really big for a little while. But a whole range of artistic creation going on behind bars. And I think just as in the free world, artists who are creating work behind bars find it to be transformational, find it to be an incredibly empowering practice to be able to create work, find it a vehicle for self-expression. This is, as they will report, and things that they would say, they find it therapeutic, they find it humanizing. And I think this is probably even more true if you're behind bars, but is true again for all artistic practices, all creative practices. I think can be very transformational, both for an individual and for a society. And we were really happy to be able to use, and I will say I want to thank CLIC and Professor Roberts and is she here? Assistant Dean Hewer. We were able to use the work. This is actually a formerly incarcerated artist named Dustin Ware on the advertising for this event. This is part of my goals for this project is to kind of model or find best practices for engaging with incarcerated artists or formerly incarcerated artists, and having artist-friendly agreements with them in ways that they are able to have their work out in the world, but in ways that they can still control and profit from. And that's exactly what we were able to do here. So I really appreciate that. I think it's a great example of this thing that I was that I'm trying to do. And the artist, he wrote a little blurb, if you will, for this event. This was on the poster. And he talks about it as this artistic practices, creative practices, as being transformational or as helpful in the human journey, saying at the end that meaning an artist can go through the stigma of being in prison and come through to acceptance. And I just think this is actually just a really beautiful piece of art. So this is just one example of the ways that somebody who's incarcerated might talk about or think about their work. And I'm so glad we were able to use it here. As I said in my work, and as Professor Roberts said in introducing me, there are many examples of creative work being done behind bars. But unfortunately also examples of efforts to suppress or deter that work, or even to punish people for it. And I have multiple examples. I won't talk about them very much, although I'm happy to share more offline, or some of them are in my article. But as you can imagine, similar to the Guantanamo art show, the Ode to the Sea art show, there are times when a prison will cancel art programs. In fact, the Colorado Department of Corrections somehow decided, I shouldn't say somehow, for some reason, decided, they were just canceling almost all educational and art programming last year. And so it just can happen. It can be random, or it can be very targeted. I think the Guantanamo detainees situation was more of a targeted situation. Curtis Dawkins, who wrote the book, as I told you, there was There was this effort, I think successful, to recapture all of the advance money that he made from that book under the cost of incarceration statute in the state of Michigan. And there have been other situations in Connecticut. Women's Prison Writing Group wrote a series of essays and stories. They won some awards, including money. The prison system responded by canceling the writing program and destroying or confiscating at least their hard drive that contained their work. So there's clearly lots and lots of creation going on in prisons, but also quite a number of instances of either using confiscating or destroying artwork as punishment, or efforts just to deter or suppress those artistic or creative practices. And this is very troubling to me, in part because, as I said, there seems to be no reason for it. There is no reason, and this is the overarching point of my article, was there's no reason not to allow these kinds of creative practices, and in particular, really not to allow the exercise of copyright from behind bars. All of the work, I don't know how many of you are, have taken IP or copyright law, and this is all fairly basic. If you are a copyright lawyer, the fact that copyright protects the art that's created behind bars. But I think that for the people who are incarcerated, many of them and their allies are not aware of the fact that all of the work that is created in prison, behind bars, is protected by copyright law, and the copyright rights can and, as I said, should be exercised by people who are incarcerated. And there are a lot of good reasons for people who are incarcerated to know about copyright law. So copyright behind bars, again, is the same as copyright not behind bars. Copyright in the free world is just the same. That copyright protects all original works of authorship. That includes anything like essays, poems, paintings, drawings, sculptures, as I said, NFTs, music, all kinds of things. Computer programs, podcasts, everything is protected as an original work of authorship. Protection arises as soon as the work is fixed in a tangible medium of expression. At the moment that happens, copyright protection arises, which means that every work created by an incarcerated artist is protected by copyright law from the moment it is created. And that's true if you're not behind bars, and it's just the same if you're behind bars. And the rights that come along with copyright, at least most broadly, really are about the ability to claim ownership, to claim authorship of your work, to control your work, to disseminate your work, and to profit from your work, to be able to sell it or license it, and to be able to sell all of this work. So these are, to me, powerful reasons for anybody to know about their copyright rights. And I think that especially in the prison context, it's worth thinking about copyright as being akin to a civil right. That it is this vehicle for self-expression. It's very empowering. It is a property right, or a property-like right. Sometimes property rights are the most protected. So I've thought a little bit about, well, maybe we should really think of it as a property right for people who are incarcerated as a way of gaining power or control in that way. Copyright can also be a tool for social change. It's a vehicle, or allows the ability to engage in the social, cultural, and political world. So I'm not saying that it's not well, it isn't constitutional, but it's not a civil right in the way that we traditionally think of civil rights. But I think it is, again, as I said, very akin to a civil right for these purposes. For people who are behind bars, I think it can be very valuable. So these are the reasons for incarcerated people to know about and to take advantage of copyright law. And there are lots of reasons not to treat the work of incarcerated artists any differently than we treat the work of non-incarcerated artists. Copyright, as many of you may know, is an intangible right. Most of the exercise of copyright takes place nowhere in the ether, if you will, or outside of the prison walls. There's lots and lots of concern, those of you who know about prison law, about safety and security and what can come into prisons and what you can do in prisons, and I'm not getting into any of that here. except to say that much of this question about the exercise of copyright is about the things that go outside the prison walls. And I think that whatever the security concerns may be are vanishingly small in the context of things that are going outside of the prison walls. And so I think that there is no reason for restrictions on those things in my view. I got behind my slides here, or I got ahead of my slides, right? But there's no, at first I said, well, there's no reason. And then what I really thought was right, there's no good or legitimate reason for treating works created behind bars any differently than work created in the free world. Oops, where am I? No, I've gotten confused. Yeah, so to be a little bit more specific, the exercise of copyright includes, and this is important, I think, because I think there's this lack of information. So this is what copyright lawyers, IP lawyers, students can bring to an incarcerated population. I spoke about it a little bit more broadly, but copyright more specifically allows for attribution. That is, you can put a copyright symbol on your work with your name on it as soon as you create it, and that lets people know whose work it is. That's in essence claiming the work. You don't have to do that, but you can do that. And for many people, I think even just knowing that they have a copyright and being able to have the credit, get the credit or the attribution for that work is extremely valuable. So that's one kind of exercising of the copyright. But copyright also gives the right to control copies of the work, to display the work, to control the display of the work or authorize that, the performance of the work, the distribution of the work, right? So it really allows somebody to decide what they want to happen with their work, how they want it to go out into the world. Now, of course, you can't control it in every single way. People can make fair use of other people's work and so on. But copyright does allow for a pretty broad control of the work created by folks. And it is, here's a great lawyer word, alienable. Probably not, maybe I shouldn't use that word here, right? But alienable, meaning it is property-like in this way, even though it's intangible, it can be sold, it can be licensed, and this is the way that you can control your work and make money from it. So these are the ways in which the specifics of copyright law can be quite valuable to people who are behind bars. And so, as I said at the beginning, the goals of my paper, and then as it's become a kind of larger project, are to bring these communities together, to bring the knowledge and information of the IP community to the community of incarcerated people and their allies, and to think about how to provide support, resources, information to incarcerated people and their allies. The allies are very important here, I think, people who are outside the prison system. To some extent, I have made this sound too easy, perhaps. There are many barriers to the exercise of copyright law from behind bars. It will take allies, people outside, to help with that. But many of the barriers are they are practical and logistical, which does not make them not real. They're very real barriers. One of the most difficult things is just getting information when you're behind bars, communicating with the outside world and the cost of communicating. I spoke with somebody who is behind bars recently, and he told me that he has to, he writes on a tablet, and I can't remember exactly what the amounts are, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this project in a minute, but he has to pay per line on a tablet, and he's essentially writing articles on a phone. That's how he's working behind bars. And many of, as some of you may be aware, many of the communication systems are exorbitantly expensive. That is, it costs. We have cell service for so much less than somebody behind bars can get, even a few, I don't know, minutes of a phone call. It's an outrage. So this providing information and resources and support is also about figuring out how to get over some of these, I would say, more practical barriers, but they are not legal barriers, and nor are they conceptual barriers to this ability to exercise copyright from behind bars. And then finally, maybe follows really cleanly from that, which is that it's really to encourage people who are behind bars to take advantage of copyright law to the extent possible. And so since I wrote this article, as I said, it's become a kind of a larger project, and I've learned a lot since the article came out. I've heard from a lot of people since the article came out. I've heard from people who are incarcerated. There are a couple of these, so like EBSCO is an academic publishing agglomerator. I don't know what you call them. That's available at least in limited form to some incarcerated people, at least in California, that I'm aware of. There are a few ways that information can leak in. And so I've heard from people who are behind bars. I've heard from law students. I've heard from lawyers. I've heard from professors of communication. It's been, in many ways, I would say the most gratifying project I have worked on in my academic career, for just the number of people who have said, either this is really interesting, or can you point me to help, or what can I do? And one of the most gratifying things is, and I'm very proud of the students at the University of Denver who have started the Incarcerated Artists Alliance, a student group at the University of Denver. And shout out to any of them who are on the Zoom right now. I don't know who's there, maybe. And so they have started this project, which is, they say that they believe that informing incarcerated artists of their intellectual property rights is one of the most effective ways of empowering self-determination and self-expression in carceral spaces. And they seek to provide resources, support, and education to empower incarcerated individuals to explore and develop their creative talents, and building a network. And one of their original plans was to go into prisons and try to do a kind of know your copyrights program, which I thought would be I really wanted to do this. And then I told you the Colorado prison said, nope, nobody can come in. So that's not happening, at least right now. But what they have done and are planning in April is an art show at the law school at the University of Denver, in which there's going to be spoken word, poetry, music, and visual art on display. There'll be an opportunity for the artists to sell their work in the appropriate case. And they're working on trying to develop a set of draft model licensing agreements, artist-friendly licensing agreements. So one thing that I found, and that they have also seen, is that there are many prison arts programs. Many. If you start looking them up, you will be overwhelmed at the number of incredible work that's being done out there for people on the outside are taking artists' work and helping those artists get their work out into the world. And it's very clear, though, that there are not very many people who know anything about copyright law engaged in any of that work, which is not I didn't mean that to be a critique, but I saw a gap there. And that's what it seems like many of these organizations could use as a set of, say, model agreements for how work could be licensed or assigned or sold. So that's been very gratifying and very fun to work with these students. I also found out about and was actually asked to be on the advisory board of this organization called the Vanguard Carceral Journalism Guild. It's a bit of a mouthful to say. This is an organization run by all started by incarcerated people who are currently incarcerated. They are, as they describe, justice-impacted professional journalists working from confinement. So one of these folks was the one I told you about, who I was talking to him, and he told me about writing on his tablet, and that all the articles he writes, he's a journalist, all the articles he writes, he's doing in these, it seemed to me like in sentence or two bits is how he's writing these very long articles. But he is working on this platform, a digital news platform. And they're working they're developing this, what they call the Society of Fellows. I found this image really compelling also. This Society of Fellows that are they're raising money and doing exactly what I suggested was needed in terms of money, which is helping incarcerated, this is mostly journalists and other writers, be able to afford to pay whatever the cost is for getting their texts or their not tweets, that's not the right word, but their work out there into the world. And so they're getting small, basically stipends or else reimbursement for the costs of their difficulties, the cost of communicating with the outside world. So they're raising money for that, but also have supports in other ways. So very interesting organization, and one I think really interestingly driven by and conceived of by incarcerated people themselves. And see, and then finally, I learned just really recently about this Edovo. Have you heard of Edovo? It's a learning platform for it says for every incarcerated American. I don't think that means it's actually available in every carceral facility. But somebody I spoke to said that in fact it is pretty widely available. There are many users. And you can have a stream or something like that. I don't know that much about it yet, actually, but seems like a very interesting possibility and a way of getting information for people who are incarcerated. And in fact, and maybe I'll sort of end with this, that I'm hopeful that they have asked that this talk be available on the Edovo platform. That is so that incarcerated people could see and maybe get at least a little bit of information about their rights and about the possibilities of copyright protection for them. And so that's just a little bit of what kind of has come out of this project. As I said, it started with me getting mad about a news story, became a law review article, and has become now kind of a bigger, it's not taking up all of my time, but certainly a larger project with a few different kind of tentacles out there in the world, and has been incredibly gratifying and incredibly humbling to see the kinds of things that people are doing under really pretty intolerable conditions in many circumstances, and doing it with so much grace and beauty. So it's been, as I said, very inspiring, and I think I'll stop there and thank you all for being here, and welcome really any questions, comments, anything you want. I thought I'd just put this back up there again because I liked it so much. So thank you all for taking the time to listen to me.
I think I'm gonna start with a couple of questions.
Great.
And then I'm gonna look around me, and I'm monitoring the Zoom as well. So my IP survey students read KJ Green and some other race and IP scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they learn about unequal access and ownership and copyright and really across IP regimes, their first question is, how can we fix it? So my question for you is, the issues you discuss in the paper are in some ways unique to incarcerated people, but in other ways, I think they are representative of issues encountered by many members of marginalized groups. So did this research lead you to any thoughts about how changes to copyright or other IP statutes or procedural requirements or substantive law might better serve members of marginalized groups? Or should the focus remain on, as you just indicated, kind of practical logistical barriers, things like that?
Well, I mean, that's such a huge question. And I think, of course, copyright law, just like all law, can be used for good and can be used as a tool of subordination and oppression. And certainly the way it is wielded and used, tends to be wielded and used by people of power, or it's easier for people of power to take advantage of the benefits of copyright law. So I did not, the short answer to your question is no, I haven't solved this problem. And the focus of this project really so far has been not one about kind of innovation in the IP, in the copyright world, or changing the rules. But I do think that copyright law really does allow, really because copyright exists as soon as the work is created. If you know about how copyright works, much of it is, as an actual practical matter, accessible to almost everybody. I think I've spent a lot of time talking with people about, for example, some of the I think one of the biggest hurdles to, for example, you notice I didn't talk about copyright registration at all. And copyright registration is one of the, I would say, the biggest hurdles for somebody behind bars. Because, as some of you may know, you don't need to register your copyright in order to have copyright protection. But if you want to sue somebody for infringement, you have to register your copyright. In order to register your copyright, you have to pay a fee. It's not a massive fee for, for me. For somebody who's behind bars, it could be impossible. And there are other real problems, and mostly the communication problems that most of the submissions are online, and you also have to submit a deposit copy of the work. Some of these things can be just logistically very difficult for somebody who's behind bars. And so I have talked with some folks who have said, well, maybe there could be a special registration system for incarcerated people. So I think that's one, I think that's a tiny little potential change. It's one that I actually haven't focused on that much because maybe I shouldn't say this, but I don't think the biggest problem is registering so they can go sue somebody for infringement. Now, of course, it would be terrible if somebody infringes the copyright of an incarcerated artist and they're unable to sort of vindicate their rights in that regard. But that is in terms of the likelihood of what somebody who's incarcerated is going to want to do with copyright law is sort of a more minor piece. I did work with a group of people on drafting a kind of, it's like, sort of like an FAQ, but a kind of registration protocol for an incarcerated person, for incarcerated people. And so that's posted and available. I'm gonna have to figure out where that is. I can't remember now. But there are, so that was at least how it's kind of a guide for how to, for an incarcerated person or for their ally on the outside to navigate the registration system. So I think there's some little tweaks like that. I think it's beyond the scope of my abilities to solve the larger.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you talk in the paper about that practical limitation that might not have occurred to everyone, which is people can't really keep their art, like they don't have somewhere to safely store it and they can't photograph it, and so they end up sending it to somebody or giving it away, and basically, by the time you're having this conversation, it's not in their possession. So that very basic limitation. So some of those practical tweaks might look like not just providing information and help, but coming in with a camera, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and I mean, I think this is one of those things for all of these prison art programs that they are the ones in communication with many incarcerated artists, sort of developing some kind of a little bit more systematic than what is currently out there in terms of preserving, cataloging, and storing people's work. But many of those programs, and again, they do incredible work. But when I go online and I realize many of them, they might, usually they say who the artist is, not even always just say who the artist is. It's not clear to me whether the artist has given them permission or under what terms to put the work out there. So I think there are lots of little steps out there where some information and knowledge I think could help a lot.
Yeah, great. Questions you guys?
If artists made using home brand or devices that are prohibited in that system, like for example, you said one of the artists is working off of a phone, because that phone wasn't allowed. Is that data protected? Is that art? Does that art belong to the artist or does it belong to the
Right. Well, I mean, even the word contraband, I think, is a highly, charged word, right? But yeah, certainly like a phone that's not prohibited. The things that I was talking about, what I was really referring to are tablets that are provided by, I think there are, at least in many institutions, tablets that you can buy or license, or I don't know, that are provided. So but the general copyright rule would be the same. That is that if you are the person who, you don't even have to be the one fixing the work in a tangible medium of expression. If it's your original expression and it becomes fixed in a tangible medium, that you were the author of it. So for example, this talk, I'm not the one recording it, but I believe that I own the copyright in my talk by virtue of it. The copyright arises by virtue of it being recorded, and I am the author, right? There's also a recording, and there may be sort of a thin copyright in the recording. But I would say that even on a contraband that is, disallowed phone, if what you're doing is texting to somebody, you're the person who is doing the texting is the copyright owner. Right, and really gets to one copyright point, which is that copyright is a right in an intangible. It's not a right in any physical item. So I would say even on contraband, that would be the copyrightable work of the author. That's a great question, though. Yeah.
So sticking kind of with that theme of logistics question, when it comes to exercising your copyright rights behind bars, not just, for example, making the art, but like in your example, you mentioned like a podcast or recording music or even like just trying to make a video. In that same range of things being so expensive to get access to behind bars, what's a way to try and overcome that hurdle? Because I could be wrong, but I don't think that prisons are just providing like microphones, to inmates in order to be able to make podcasts or whatever, record music. So what's a way to overcome that hurdle and to help overcome that hurdle from the position that we are in?
Right.
And then also there was mention of the journalism the society that
right,
was
the fellows.
money and the fellows that were raising money that way. So that because then also I don't and I'm sorry I'm rambling with this question. I don't want it you don't want to be burdening because now I'm paying the money for you to create, and so now that person who's creating might feel like they owe. So I don't know. Right.
Well, so one of the roles in which I'm an advisor for the Carceral Journalism Guild is trying to help them get agreements in place with all of the contributors that at least make clear whatever is going on, that the people who are contributing the work own the copyright of the work. So there's no agreement that they're signing the copyright in exchange for the support. And I think the larger problem that you point to, is really a problem. I mean, there's, I'm a little glib about saying, oh, there's just lots of practical problems, but in fact, there's lots of practical problems and they're deeply problematic. And so, for example, I think you're right that it is going to be difficult and there's much distrust. Many of the people on the inside are distrustful, for good reason, of, do-gooders coming in. And so I think it's a difficult problem to manage. There are a number of prison podcasts, and that they do get out in the world. I think there are so many theater programs, which is a little bit different in terms of the copyright issues, but there are so many of these things, and they all rely on people outside the system who are trusted allies or friends, lawyers, and so this is a problem that the problems that are going on, even just in the trying to get your work out there, are only partly legal problems, and so there's lots of other problems that are not. Copyright's not going to solve those problems. I think really and it's a much broader problem than just for creative work. This the cost of just the phone calls, the cost of communication is it's an absolute outrage. And it's just you guys probably know more about this than I do, but these no bid contracts that it's extortionate rates for those sorts of things. So I'm not answering your question, but I think it's going to take lots of sort of inputs from lots of sides to deal with these problems. But what I think, as I said, overall, I feel like this project is, as I said, wildly aspirational, and we're not moving into a better phase, I don't think, of what our prison system is going to look like. I'm not feeling super optimistic. So I understand that there's all kinds of hurdles to this. But what I really saw in a lot of the work, the things in the research was there are lots and lots of cases where prisons supported artwork, encouraged people to do artwork, helped them get it out, or at least allowed it easily to get out and allowed people to make money. So what that tells me is that it's possible. what it tells me is that the prison systems could just decide that they want to do this. And I know it's unlikely that they will, but I think it's worth saying. There's this incredible article that I read that really helped inspire some of this, called something like Free World Law Behind Bars. So as you can see, it really did inspire this. And it sort of said, it was like, this is a matter to some extent of political will, and not of anything else. Like, there's no law in the way of this happening. So, I mean, that made me feel, I don't know if it made me feel a little better, but I think like we have to find the places where things are at least possible. So I think it's people on the outside, I don't know, raising money. Answering letters, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm curious, once the work is out, how do they actively find the list of possible infringement of their work? And how do they negotiate with unions?
Well, so again, I mean, so if there's possible infringement out there, you know, it's, I mean, if you're behind bars, it's gonna be really hard to sort of check things out and make sure your work isn't gonna be, isn't being infringed. And so I think just like all of these other things, it's gonna rely on allies outside to sort of work on an incarcerated person's behalf. I mean, so just as it would take somebody saying, oh, here's a model agreement. So in fact, the student group at DU is working with a law firm who's doing this on a pro bono basis, because my students are not engaging in the unauthorized practice of law by drafting agreements for folks. And so working with a law firm that is, you know, they're gonna draft a kind of these sort of a form, a template, with the idea being, here are the things that you should be thinking about when you're entering into one of these agreements, when you're an incarcerated person or if you're an ally on the outside helping them with that. But I think, I mean, as long as we have prisons, it's probably gonna take some coordination and help with somebody on the outside helping that person, you know, get information. And the same will be true for identifying instances of infringement. You know, it's not, you know, I'm sure it varies from prison to prison what kinds of information comes in. But I think there's not like, it's not like they have access to the internet. Almost in those circumstances, so. You know, it's sort of why I thought this is, as I said, the project is one of bringing together of different communities of people who maybe didn't know they had things to say to each other. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. There's so many interesting things about what's available in prison for people to have a life that's outside of the cell and what's inside of it. Right. So your work is really important in terms of the interface between legal recognition of that creativity. So I just want to salute you for that. I'm curious, there are many things I'd like to ask, but let me just focus on one, and that has to do with some SAM laws.
Yeah.
Which I know have been ruled unconstitutional in a couple of jurisdictions, and that's work that's really adjacent to yours.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering what you think of that, because there's a difference. I'm imagining that there's a difference between saying that a prisoner deserves the copyright and the ownership recognition. And copyright's not my field, but criminal law is my field. Okay, but I'm imagining that one could imagine a separation between the ownership piece, the control piece, and the profit piece. And I'm just wondering what your opinion is of this on SAMLAX.
I mean, I'm not a criminal law person or a First Amendment person or constitutional law more broadly, but I think, I mean, so I did spend a little bit of time looking into this, so because almost every law professor I talked to about this project was like, well, what about Son of Sam laws?
And it's for the folks who have never heard of this before.
Yes, the Son of Sam laws is essentially, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, get this wrong, but essentially this rule that you cannot profit from, and maybe not even own, the rights in a book that is or any other thing that's about your crime.
They did that to OJ, so
Yes.
he lost the wrongful death suit, so they said he couldn't profit off his book.
Okay,
Well, then, right, so
Right.
Summer Sound was based on a very infamous murder,
right,
and then a book that Sandra, started with an L, wrote about the murder. It became a bestseller. He became a millionaire. His family went nuts.
right,
And then New York State passed for the first Summer Sound law.
right,
And to the best of my knowledge, about 8 states ruled them to be unconstitutional
Yeah.
under First Amendment.
right, that it's a violation of the First Amendment too.
To have a law that
That
disenfranchises someone to profit from their own speech.
right, right, and that, I mean, it seems like pretty clear to me, like state action suppression of speech, so like, you know, I don't think you have to know that much about the First Amendment. I mean, to me, that seems, unless we're saying that if you're incarcerated, you have lost your First Amendment rights, which I don't think we should say. So I mean, again, this is not really exactly my field, but I feel like the only rights you should lose when you're incarcerated are the rights that are specifically the legislature has said you forfeit. That's my view, but, so, you know, I think, you know, of course, a strong view, which I think is the one I have, which is that creators should own the rights to their work and be able to profit from them, is gonna result at times in people who I find detestable profiting from their work. I mean, you know, I think that that's true. So, but I'm not sure that I think that trying to police that is, I mean, I don't think it's appropriate anyway, but I certainly don't think it's worth trying to figure out which are the ones that we should deem unacceptable. I spent some time thinking about, is this okay for me to say? I spent some time thinking about the January 6th chorus. And in connection with my work, I'm thinking like, oh, God, I guess I have to like think of them as artists who are incarcerated. And so it sort of put me in this, I mean, I did think, okay, well, you know,
Who's gander?
yeah, I think that that's right. So, you know, I think it's, you know, puts you in a tricky position. I've had people say, well, yeah, this is all good, but they can't make money off the work they create in prison, any incarcerated person. And I said, my view is I think that you should be able to. Primarily for the reason that almost everybody who is in prison is gonna be out of prison.
Not lifers,
Right.
not murderers.
Not right, but many people who are in prison are gonna be out of prison. And even when they're not at the like that again, this notion that they're not that far away from us, they're a part of our community. And there's a lot of evidence out there, again, some of you probably know a lot more than I do, that things like art programs are quite rehabilitative. That the ability to do these kinds, and other things, educational programs, are reduce recidivism, increase the safety and security of the prison facilities. So there are, I think, multiple sort of strands that say, well, I think that creative practices behind bars should be not just permitted but encouraged, and that all the rights that flow from that should flow to the creators of the work. So a very interesting question though, and obviously politically fraught. Yeah, oh, there were some other, I don't know where to go first.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, what is the process of filing in civil court look like for someone incarcerated, or no matter what level of access do most prisoners have to civil options?
Well, there's probably somebody in the room who can answer this question better than I can. And so it's, you know, you can get visits from lawyers. So if you have a lawyer, you know, you can have a lawyer. I assume that, you know, there are lots of people who litigate their habeas petitions pro se. I don't know, now I'm talking out of school here. This is beyond the scope. But I mean, I think that many of the issues are basically the same, and that it's very difficult to communicate with the outside world. And certainly that engaging with any sort of official anything is difficult because you don't have internet access. measured, so many things are, I get letters from prisoners, they're all handwritten. And just that's how it works, so, but you can write a petition to a court, and do that, but it's really not any different for if you wanted to sue for copyright infringement than if you want to sue for anything else for somebody who's behind bars.
I want to go to Professor Stein, yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
I think I have a similar question, but I'll phrase it as a copyright question.
Right.
Why isn't this the 106A project?
Oh, so
You
this
have to
is,
explain that.
yeah, so 106A has to do with, it's called the Visual Artists' Rights Act. That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious because the stories you told
Right.
have a bunch of things where there's just obvious violation of moral rights. I was like trying to flip through the Berne Convention to see if terms of our treaties are a little more explicit than the terms of our laws.
Right, so, I mean, I guess I would say, maybe that's the next project or another sort of more specific project. So the 106A, the Visual Artists' Rights Act, provides some additional and kind of separate sorts of protections for works of visual art, and in particular works that are, this is not my area of expertise within copyright, but works that are often, in particular when there's only one version of the work. So many paintings, of course, or sculptures, there's only one of them. Copyright is, in some ways, kind of traditional or prototypical copyright is about the right to control copies, which doesn't map perfectly onto works of visual art where there's only one of them, only one original. So the set of rights that come along that we adopted in part to harmonize with international treaties and international obligations is slightly different. So I think that there could be a particular set of questions or hopefully answers or suggestions or something that apply in particular to works of visual art. There are many examples that are not visual art. There's lots of writing, lots of music, and other things. But you're right that I think there are particular problems when there is only one copy of something. Put it that way, most simply, and probably more sort of violations either of the law or of the autonomy and other expressive interests that somebody might have in their work with respect to those works of visual art. So this project was in a way I saw as a like the broadest possible lens on creative practices. So it's dive deep into that particular one, but I think you're right that that's not fully explored here. Yeah.
I'm not sure like how much in this realm this is, but I've seen cases where like there are, can any art that is created or like songs created like behind bars, can that be used to incriminate, like that uses evidence? I know like.
Well, there's
So, sorry, just to interject, Candy is having a fantastic speaker on this topic in March, and there's a documentary film, I think, that's coming out, and so there's gonna be screening and a Q&A with that person, so stay tuned for that.
Sweet.
well, and I think, and so maybe you might know more about this than I do, but isn't there this whole problem with some, lyrics of some
Yeah.
songs and whether they can be admissible?
There was a rapper who
Yes.
Yeah,
basically
right.
he was saying about killing somebody and like he matched up very closely to homicide.
It's like an evidentiary question, which is really not like.
And there's some defamation cases on
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that doesn't necessarily like either overlap with or conflict with the copyright issues, so, but it's certainly, if you wrote something, I mean, I don't know whether it should be then admissible, but what's your,
I
what
guess
are your
like
thoughts about that?
I wonder if it's copyright protect, like if I were to write a song in prison about something that could incriminate me, if I apply for a copyright or like I'm not sure just how copyright works, but like,
Right.
does that shield me from?
Oh, no.
No, okay. I don't know, sorry.
Right, no, I mean, if I wrote a, defamation, I think is a great example. I mean, if I write an article where I defame somebody in it, I own the copyright in the article as soon as I write the article, and if I defame somebody, well, that's my copyright is not any sort of defense to the defamation. So, but there are some of these interesting, I think that the lyrics as, evidence are kind of an interesting question.
There have been two legislative attempts to basically rule those things inadmissible as a specific part of the evidence code.
Oh, that's interesting. In Massachusetts?
No, one in California and New York.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's a great question. Right, so you have to be, I mean, you know, it's interesting, the creative work as expression, which it all is expression, but so that's one of the things that allegedly justifies many of the restrictions on sending work out. So at least I know at our civil rights clinic at the University of Denver works based entirely with people who are imprisoned in the Supermax facility in Colorado. So it's as like the worst of the worst are all there, and they have a very difficult time getting any work out because I guess there's this concern that there are going to be like messages encoded in the artwork. So there's huge amounts of review of like their paintings and drawings. So the folks in that prison create a ton of work apparently, and I asked to like try to see some of it, and it's hard they can't get it out because they're worried about. They say they're worried that there are like hidden messages in the paintings. I don't know how to evaluate that kind of concern. So I'm not gonna say it would never happen, but anyway, I think it's interesting that you know, it is expression. It's all expression, and then sometimes that can be problematic for you, depending on what you've expressed.
I'm gonna ask a question from the folks online.
Oh,
Isha
great.
Dalal asks, are there any existing or nascent legislative or policy initiatives out there to guarantee or expand copyright protections for incarcerated artists?
Well, as I said, not that I know of. I mean, the one thing is that there were some people who were, and I don't know where this is, were thinking about trying to work with the Copyright Office to allow for a registration procedure that either, you know, that made it easier to sort of get over some of the hurdles and maybe reduce the cost of copyright registration. So that's one thing that I've heard about. That's not sort of you know, it's not happening yet. And I haven't heard about anything else. I mean, what's interesting is that it sort of exists in a space like, it's not like there's anything now, I mean, other than maybe these couple Son of Sam laws, I mean, there's nothing now in the law that says that somebody who's incarcerated can't do all of these things that I'm encouraging them to do, which is one of the things that gives me a little hope, right? I mean, that's sort of why it's at least possible that people could just start doing this and do it more. And if there isn't pushback, they can do it. So there's nothing preventing it now. So, you know, I think it's interesting to think about, well, would it be good to have some sort of legislation, or is it better to say, well, where we are is in a lot of ways, okay. And that's what I mean about sort of both probably totally unrealistic, but technically very possible for people to do this. So it's a good question. And I mean, I'm interested in thinking about that. There was one settlement of a dispute. I talk about it in my paper. This guy, Victor Martin, wrote novels, and he was punished, I don't know for what, not for something he wrote, but they, in the course of that, they destroyed one of his novels, his only copy of the novel, and the ACLU on his behalf sued, and part of the settlement involved, they said, you have to allow prisoners to do this creative work, and you have to allow them to be able to get the work out there and to copyright it. So they actually mentioned in the settlement that, oh, you have to, the prison says, and I guess the prison agreed to do this, we will help, or at least make it possible for prisoners to do this, for incarcerated people to do this. So I think it'd be interesting to see something along those lines develop, but I have not heard of anything.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm curious because Professor Roberts had mentioned that it was relatively difficult to get this artwork licensed, like for the flyer for the event. So I was wondering sort of if you could talk about that, or also just sort of in general, when you want to license something or it has to be on an art show or whatever, what are the necessary permissions? Like, is it just the artist, or do you need to go broadly into the prison? Like, what are the kinds of permissions?
Well, I mean, so I'm not sure exactly what where there were difficulties, but one of the real difficulties was, if you wanna have an agreement with somebody who is incarcerated, you can't just call them up and say, hey, I'll email you the agreement. So that all your back and forth with an artist has to be, will take time. So that's one, I don't know, that was one issue, was like, oh, we wanna do this, but we didn't plan far enough in advance to have like 2 months worth of finding somebody whose work we wanted to use and then doing it. So that's one of the biggest problems, is just, it takes a long time to get anything done, and you have to send hard copy pieces of paper, and they might only be able to send you back something that's handwritten. So that's certainly one piece of it. I think another, a problem can be that people who are incarcerated are, as I said, like, for good reason, maybe quite suspicious sometimes of, potential things like this. So, and part of that is not knowing what their rights are, what an agreement would look like that is good for them, and what an appropriate amount of compensation would be, say. I mean, that's hard. It's hard for lots of artists who are not incarcerated, so it's just like 1,000 times more difficult for people who are, I represented artists and writers before I was a professor, and they didn't know anything either. And so I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, so I'll say, Dustin is no longer incarcerated, and he was incredibly responsive, and our finance department was very responsive, so that was just me wanting like instant gratification. And I had this idea late in the game, it was like time to make the flyer, and I said, wait a sec, it would be a cool flyer. So that was totally on me, but still really a great question, interesting question. This is totally out there, and you may not have an answer, you probably won't have an answer, but you're visiting us in a time of so much uncertainty and crisis, and in particular for immigrant populations, and we're increasingly hearing about people being detained and held indefinitely, and just reading your paper again in that context, it's not the same as being incarcerated, but it has some similarities. So I just wondered if any of your remarks today extend to those populations, or if you have thoughts on copyright for folks with uncertain immigration status who feel their citizenship has an asterisk next to it in a similar way. And I think the short answer, is they should get copyright, and they can, and there's nothing technically standing in their way, kind of a similar answer that you've given, but any kind of extrapolating.
Yeah, it's so devastating to think that, as I said, this feels sort of like too aspirational, and I don't know, it's like where do we go from here on this? One problem, I've thought about this, one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen is drawings from the, and this predates this time, is drawings from the ICE detention facility in along the Texas border, children's drawings. It's made me cry thinking about it right now. And that's, I certainly would have my same views. I think it's so much more, the sort of the practical difficulties are 1,000 times more for folks who are in detention facilities where they don't have access to lawyers, where they get moved around a lot. There certainly aren't art programs at those places. There aren't, it's just, I haven't been there, but that's my understanding. And so, I could see that many folks would be much more deterred from trying to exercise any rights of any kind, and out of concern for, you don't wanna get noticed for any of the wrong reasons, I would assume. But I would have to think that creative practices would be just as powerful, if not more, in those sorts of circumstances. As I said, seeing these children's drawings is just horrible. So now I'm crying.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. That's me. So I think that's I think that tells us more about our carceral system than anything else, or immigration system and so on. Yeah,
The last interchange has made me want to ask the question about, I don't know the answer to this. All of the artwork and all of the poetry that came out of Therese Therese and Stadt in terms of the detention camp or outfits.
yeah,
And in particular, I never saw another butterfly, which was all children's drawings. A book of all children's drawings that were made by children who were imprisoned at Therese and Stadt on the way to Auschwitz.
yeah.
Whatever happened, who owns that work? How did those books have sold,
I don't know.
have had a huge impact.
Yeah,
The music that was created by the
Right.
musicians at Theresienstadt,
right,
because it was a model prison camp, so the Nazis could show it to
Right.
the International Red Cross. There was music that was created at
Yeah.
Theresienstadt. What happened to the copyright of the musicians? We have a program here at Northeastern every April, which is dedicated to art and music associated with the Holocaust.
wow, incredible,
And I just never thought about what happened to all of that ownership and I guess all of that money that was
Right.
generated or has been generated by
I don't know the
this
answer to that
performance or
question.
sale of those words.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question, but that's very interesting, I wanna know about that. There's some really, weird is not even the right word for it, these problematic issues about copyright ownership for stateless people who are stateless, which this actually came up in the context of thinking about the folks at Guantanamo. And then there's this, for a while, I guess, Hitler himself was stateless, and so there's this question, this is such a weird story, this question, there's a Yale Law Journal about the copyright in Mein Kampf. Anyway, which I was like, well, that's a whole other topic that, so like, you know, for people who are stateless, which may, I don't even know whether we would think of, you know, I don't know what the copyright ownership questions would be, and certainly not, I don't know German mid-last century copyright law. But fascinating, I mean, what those stories really say to me is how powerful the idea of creative practices are, and especially in these horrific circumstances. So thank you I'd like to know more about that, yeah.
Circling back, do incarcerated minors have the same rights to their artwork as incarcerated adults?
They should, yeah. I mean, so copyright law says as soon as a work is created, the rights arise in the author. And so it doesn't, you know, a minor may not have the same ability to contract with their, you know, with their art. But in terms of authorship, there should be no distinction.
If a minor is incarcerated, could the facility that they're at contract for them since they're guardianship of the minor?
Ooh. I don't know. That sounds horrible.
That's not horrible.
is that how it works? Is that the understanding, is that they are, but they're not, it's not like they have power of attorney. Does the institution have that kind of, I don't know the answer to that question. I know I'm not supposed to stand up here and say I don't know the answer to that question.
It does happen. There's another question online about California law that says an incarcerated person's right to inherit, own, sell, or convey real and or personal property does not include the right to possess such property within the institutions or facilities of the department. And I think this is kind of pulling back to the strand that we were discussing earlier about the inability to kind of hang on to tangible creative works. So this person asked, could this be used to oppress artists since copyrights are intangible personal property, at least for tax purposes?
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that law in particular, but it says something about, but it's about physical
Yeah.
ownership inside facilities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, it's a challenge for anyone trying to create work, and I assume it must be very difficult to get other things from the outside and bring them into your cell. I assume that's highly restricted. So, but an interesting thing about, I mean, it sounds like some of that's about inheriting, I don't know, if you inherit, you can inherit a copyright ownership. That doesn't involve sort of, again, anything inside the cell.
Right.
But it does sound like something that could be used in ways that we might find problematic that law.
Yeah.
So I'd have to look at it a little bit more to really get a sense of what's going on there. In some ways, California prisons are, in my very limited knowledge, but folks there seem to have a lot more access to a lot more things than in many other jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Yeah, it seems so, like more, as I said, like this EBSCO thing, like access to articles and news, a little bit more broadly. So, which doesn't mean they're not oppressive in other ways.
Any last questions? Okay, I will ask one last question. I think we covered this for the most part, but you talked about Martin's case and the work of the ACLU and the different kind of student organizations. So anything else you want to say about how we lawyers can help in this larger endeavor or help specific people practically? Are there programs that you haven't mentioned through which volunteer IP lawyers can help people register copyrights and secure other IP rights related to their creative works?
I guess I don't have too much more to add to
Yeah.
that. I think as I was a litigator myself, I think as law students, many people think, well, where are the lawsuits that I can be involved in? And that is, of course, very important in lots of ways, but I feel like for the most part, in terms of like these creative practices and sort of encouraging and allowing creative expression behind bars, the work is in these, either the sort of transactional side agreements and so on in education, and in sort of building relationships, either with prison arts programs, as I said, that don't seem to have much knowledge of copyright law, perfectly understandably, and folks who are on the inside, right? And so that to me is the biggest challenge and the place with the biggest sort of, where there's the biggest gap. Where I think lawyers could help, but it's hard to do much that's not just one-to-one communication with folks on the inside. As I said, we were talking about developing a know your copyrights kind of presentation, sort of a more detailed version of parts of this talk in a way for prison populations, but that would require really being able to go into having a situation where you can go into a prison. So I think it's interesting I mean, there are some lawsuits out there, but I think litigation is not the primary thing that's necessary here in my view.
Yeah.
So maybe more difficult.
Thank you so much.